Hell no, we won't Namco. It's NES Works Gaiden Epoch-02. Looking beyond the Cassette Vision's launch titles to its follow-up releases, we already see certain patterns of behavior emerging that would define the Cassette Vision throughout its life. That is to say, Epoch is brazenly swiping other companies' intellectual properties, repurposing existing technology, and establishing a once-per-quarter release schedule for the system that would last throughout its lifetime. According to unsourced dates on GameFAQs.com, Epoch launched the Cassette Vision in July of 1981 with two games, Baseball and KIKORI no YOSAKU. By that same account, the system's third release, Galaxian, arrived a month later in August of 1981. According to unsourced dates on GameFAQs, the Cassette Vision made its debut in July 1981 with Baseball and KIKORI no YOSAKU. By the same account, the first follow-up release for Cassette Vision, Galaxian, shipped a month later in August. No, it's not that Galaxian. To my knowledge, Namco had as much to do with this release as SNK did with KIKORI no YOSAKU, which is to say, none whatsoever. Now, some online sources suggest that Epoch did indeed go legit with this release. One extraordinarily ancient Japanese games database referenced on Wikia's PAC-MAN site lists Galaxian as an Epoch Namco joint. However, it offers no further information on this claim, whereas Masayuki Horie's interview on Game Odyssey suggests that Namco's involvement came later, when Epoch had to pay a licensing fee after the game's release. Which is to say, it seems that Epoch took its usual liberal approach to others' intellectual property here, and simply used the trademark name Galaxian without stopping to ask Namco if that would be okay. In Epoch's defense, you can understand why the idea of licensing their release may not have occurred to them in advance. That simply wasn't how the nascent Japanese games industry did things at the time. Or for that matter, it's not how they did things in the West. Look at the history of gaming in the 1970s. Someone would create an idea, and everyone else would borrow it. Epoch had already produced standalone Pong and Breakout clones based on Atari's games, but it's not like Atari came up with the concept for Pong in the first place. Nolan Bushnell famously borrowed the idea from Ralph Baer's early brown box Odyssey demos at Magnavox, which in turn built on William Higginbotham's Tennis for Two demos from the 1950s. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the stewards of these landmark works, Atari with Pong and Breakout, Taito with Space Invaders, and so on, even welcomed the cloned devices. Neither company had the manufacturing capacity to meet demand, and the prevalence of derivative products helped prime the pump for video game acceptance in the broader market, enhancing the appeal of both the medium and these original games. That mindset rolled right into the 1980s, and Galaxian, the next big thing after Space Invaders, became a popular target for knockoffs. I've mentioned the relationship between Bruderbund and SoftPro over in NES Works Gaiden, and according to the Digital Antiquarian, these two companies originally came together to distribute SoftPro's unlicensed rendition of Galaxian for PCs in the US. So, emerging from a background in which everyone simply played fast and loose with video game property rights, the illicit nature of Galaxian for Cassette Vision doesn't come off as Epoch trying to rip off Namco. It was just business as usual. Besides, it's not like you'd ever mistake this Galaxian for Namco's. Outside of the common general Space Invaders-like setup of the action, a defense unit at the bottom of the screen firing up into a fleet of moving enemies, the two games have very little in common. Namco's Galaxian switched up the invaders' dynamic by clustering the alien fleet into a relatively static group that simply drifted within a contained space rather than marching progressively downward. Rather than pressing a steady full fleet assault, the aliens would instead peel off from the main group individually or in small groups to attack the player directly. Epoch's Galaxian is not that game. It definitely owes something to Space Invaders, but it seemingly owes its greatest debt to Nichibutsu's Moon Cresta. Yes, the irony here is that Epoch lifted Namco's trademarked name, but not their gameplay, so they got into hot water without even really taking full advantage of their eventual legal peril. Epoch Galaxian also switches things up by alternating its gameplay patterns with each wave. The invaders here never form up a fleet, but instead attack in small groups with somewhat chaotic patterns that vary once you clear a full group. In Phase 1, multiple enemies appear as small shapes that perform small orbits around an invisible individual fulcrum, steadily making their way downward into the player's space. As they spin around, the aliens can also grow up to 2 sizes larger, which makes them easier targets but also more likely to smash into the player as those creatures near the bottom of the screen's edge. Once an alien reaches the bottom of the screen, it vanishes and reappears above in its tiny 4-pixel initial form. If you manage to clear out all the invaders, you'll move along to Phase 2, which initially seems to work the same way as the previous level, but soon reveals a key difference: aggressive dive bombing. Here, aliens appear in a cloud overhead and drift around. Rather than slowly make their way toward the bottom of the screen, however, here they transform instantly into different shapes and make a quick strike directed to the player's position. The invaders can take 2 forms, either a spacecraft that darts swiftly in a direct line downward, or as a sort of lumpy asteroid that zips downward at a 45-degree angle. The third phase builds on this, retaining the dual form transformations but adding an element of direct targeting to the invader's behavior. Here the aliens fly back and forth across the screen in their small initial form. When one of these embryonic aliens crosses the player's line of fire, it has a chance of transforming into a rocket and zooming downward. Some aliens will randomly turn into asteroids that strike at you from an angle. Together, these force you to stay on your toes to avoid attacks from 2 different directions. And if you manage to survive these 3 waves, you complete the game with a sort of bonus stage. In the bonus level, your ship finally breaks free of the screen's bottom and begins a journey to the top of the playing field where a flying saucer awaits. You can simply fly off the screen to move along to the next stage, but if you manage to line up your ship's flight with a recessed spot in the saucer's underside, you'll dock and earn a bonus. This level might remind you of Atari's Space Race, as you need to dodge the debris that fills the screen by adjusting your thrust speed. It takes a little practice to work out the timing of dodging the space hazards while still linking up with your mothership. Hit a space rock or the flat underside of the saucer and you lose a life. Altogether, it's a pretty interesting take on the Invaders format. As Horie said in his all-important interview, the Epoch development team was a pretty interesting bunch of guys, with weird tastes and big ambitions. In terms of play options, Galaxian for Cassette Vision falls somewhere between YOSAKU and Baseball. You don't quite have the panoply of difficulty or gameplay options available as in YOSAKU. Instead, you can simply choose between slow, which is to say easy, and fast, which is to say hard, movement. One notable surprise for those accustomed to the limitations of post-Invader games, including the actual Galaxian, is that your ship has the ability to unload rapid-fire shots here, rather than being limited to a single projectile at a time. This makes the action less about perfectly lining up shots one at a time, and more about strategically filling space with lasery death. It's not actually Galaxian, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Epoch may not have had much imagination when it came to naming their games, but they made up for it with interesting takes on established concepts. Enthusiastic Cassette Vision owners didn't receive a new game release in September of 1981, forcing them to make do with those 3 games from July and August until October arrived, along with the system's 4th game. And that's fine. Play patterns and expectations were very different back in the days when the simple existence of devices that let you manually control on-screen objects itself was a miracle of technology. And besides, Epoch more than made up for it by combining a remarkable 12 games into a single cartridge with cassette number 4, Big Sports 12. Admittedly, the eponymous Big Sports 12 felt a little dated by late 1981, as most of the play modes here just offered variants on Pong. You know, Pong, the game that Atari and Magnavox had debuted nearly a decade earlier. Pong clones dominated the mid-1970s, and in fact, Epoch got its start by releasing a dedicated clone console called Electro Tennis. And there's no points for correctly guessing what style of game that involved. But the world moved on from Pong to Breakout clones, and then Invaders clones, leaving Pong as a dusty relic. Heck, even Atari had disowned the brand by 1977, publishing its collection of Pong variants for Atari 2600 as Video Olympics. But here we are in the far future year of 1981. The yen is about to become the world's most powerful currency. Coca-Cola is about to become Coke. Disco is dying. And somehow, Epoch expects us to be excited about Pong. If this cartridge comes off as a bit dated, well, there's a reason for that. It effectively hails from 1977. Yes, much as with baseball, Big Sports 12 began life as a dedicated console which Epoch shrank into cartridge format. In this case, Big Sports 12 descends from a standalone TV device called TV Game System 10. You may notice the small difference in numeration here. 10 is not 12. And that's because, unlike the direct console to cart conversion seen in Cassette Vision Baseball, Big Sports 12 expands on and revises the older platform. According to game historian Lenny Herman, the Cassette Vision project as a whole emerged from work the company had done on a sequel device to System 10. Rather than simply forging ahead by building the Super 10 follow-up as a dedicated console, Epoch went bigger and leaned into the inevitable tide of programmable consoles that clearly represented the future of home gaming. The company turned its System 10 revision into a more elaborate project, a console with interchangeable carts. You can tell that Epoch had Big Sports 12 in mind when building the Cassette Vision hardware, because the console interface embraces this collection's design even more than baseball did. Big Sports 12 contains, yes, 12 game modes, 5 Pong variants, 4 shooting games, and 3 games that kind of straddle the line between the two. A few fine details set this Pong clone apart from the competition. For one thing, the 4 shooting events here make use of the Cassette Vision's sole peripheral, a light gun. Now, you can tell this release predates America's 1980s gun scare, because Epoch created a startling realistic interpretation of a German Mauser as the light gun for the Cassette Vision. Bizarre as it feels these days to come across a light gun that looks decidedly like an actual weapon, most light and toy guns of that era just looked like that. The NES Zapper was an exception rather than the rule. The Cassette Vision Mauser stands out as remarkable for many other reasons. For starters, this accessory also has its origins in the System 10 console. Epoch repackaged it as a Big Sports 12 tie-in, but anyone who owned the pistol that had shipped alongside System 10 in 1977 could simply plug it into the Cassette Vision and play Big Sports 12. In fact, that's what I had to do here. I managed to acquire a System 10 gun a couple of years ago, but when I ordered the updated model for this series, Customs put the kibosh on it. The gun I bought now sits in international limbo, unable to be delivered, because American law treats toy guns as infinitely more dangerous than real ones. Interestingly, the Mauser doesn't use some special connector. It plugs into a standard 1/4-inch stereo jack on the console's face. The 4 gun mode games in Big Sports 12 would be the only time the console ever made use of this peripheral, and when Epoch released the compact, low-cost Cassette Vision Junior in 1983, they removed the accessory jack altogether, meaning that the Cassette Vision Junior lacks compatibility with 1/4 of the play modes in this cart. No great loss, mind you, but the weirdness of the Mauser does make Big Sports 12's shooting gallery events stand out as pretty unique takes on the light gun concept. The gun came standard with a plastic holder for storage, which you could clip to the butt of the pistol and use as a stock. And most unusually, the Mauser came equipped with a working hammer. Epoch didn't simply include this element for show, it plays a critical role in the game. See, the game won't register a shot fired from the Mauser until you cock the hammer. There's no such thing as rapid fire in this game, because you have to cock the hammer after every single shot. In terms of gameplay, this doesn't make a huge difference. None of these events move at a rapid enough pace that you need to worry about being fast to reload. But it does create a sense of verisimilitude, otherwise lacking in a game where you shoot tiny squares of light moving around a field of black. The 4 gun events in Big Sports 12 amount to different variants on the concept of shooting a square, which in fairness means this is simply the light gun format distilled to its bare essence. After all, if you've seen the freeze-frame images of, say, Duck Hunt or NES, you've seen that the NES Zapper also shot at squares of light that had simply been dressed up to look like something more elaborate. The Cassette Vision's tech lacked the power to add that window dressing, so squares. Gun 1 gives you a single block that sails around the screen, bouncing off the edges to reflect at the opposite angle. In Gun 2, the block only bounces once before traveling off the screen, giving you a more limited window of time in which to land a hit. In Gun 3, a block appears in random spots around a 9-square grid across the screen, and you have a split second in which to take aim and fire. And in Gun 4, a block streaks past horizontally from one side of the screen to the other, giving you a tiny window of time in which to score a hit. Surprisingly, in my experience, Gun 4 turned out to be the easiest mode, since the blocks move strictly horizontally. It may simply be that the 45-year-old peripheral I used for these recordings has lost some accuracy over the decades, but hitting blocks moving on a diagonal axis proved to be remarkably difficult for the Mauser. In any case, these modes are about as minimalist a target shooting game as you can possibly imagine. The games work, but they're far from exciting. Far more interesting are the other games on this cartridge. Even though Big Sports 12 largely consists of Pong variants, these Pong variants do things their own way. This makes for one of history's more unusual compilations of Pong derivatives. The one downside being that the same elements that make Big Sports 12 so interesting also make it nearly impossible to play solo. Like baseball, Big Sports 12 does not really offer single-player pursuits outside of the target shooting mode. However, where you could ostensibly train yourself to become ambidextrous enough to handle both teams in a game of baseball, you literally do not have enough appendages to play the modes in Big Sports 12 solo. Despite being a collection of Pong-alikes, each one of Big Sports 12's games demands the use of both hands at once. Unsurprisingly, given that the console emerged from the specific project's development process, Epoch designed the Cassette Vision hardware specifically to meet the needs of Big Sports 12. That's why the console contains an unprecedented 4 rotary dials on its face. Epoch simply didn't feel content creating normal Pong clones where you move the paddle up and down on one side of the screen. No, they brought a second axis of movement into play, allowing you to zip around the screen in 360 degrees of motion. The dials on each side of the machine control movement on a different axis, one horizontal and one vertical. You can certainly play Big Sports 12 solo against yourself, but since you need both hands to properly control a single paddle, you can only really get a fraction of your potential range of motion this way. It's neat, but the lack of support for solo play against the CPU makes Big Sports 12 feel more like a 1970s LSI-era relic than the fact that it bundles together a bunch of Pong interpretations. As for the modes in question, well, you begin with tennis, the most Pong-like format here. Tennis actually varies slightly from most of the other modes by letting you only move up and down, but it retains its 2-dial gimmick by giving you control over 2 paddles at once. I guess this is meant to represent doubles in which one very tall person teams up with one very short person per side, or something like that. The second mode, volleyball, plays more or less like tennis, with a dotted center line rather than solid. It modifies the rules slightly to limit the way in which your quote-unquote team members can hit the ball. Mode 3, practice, is the closest you'll find here to a single-player friendly game. You control 2 paddles as you bounce a ball off a wall on the right side of the screen. Mode 4, soccer, fully integrates the dual-axis control scheme into play by pitting 2 players against one another on either side of the screen. Your soccer team consists of a single paddle, but that paddle can move freely around its half of the field. It barely resembles real-world soccer since you're just kicking the ball at the other player's goal with no dribbling or passing. But the field does incorporate 2 balls to represent said goal, so I guess that's something. Mode 5, squash, rounds out the Pong derivatives with a 2-player interpretation of practice mode. 2 people control a single paddle apiece, bouncing the ball off a wall and trying to avoid letting the other player knock it past them off the screen to the left. And finally, you have 3 shooting modes, which work a lot like the archery mode that would appear in Konami's Track and Field a few years later. Your avatar, a paddle of course, stands at the left side of the screen and attempts to fire an arrow at a target that moves downward along the right edge. You can move your paddle up and down before firing, and you can use a dial to steer the arrow to a limited degree, both of which abilities prove essential, as each subsequent mode complicates the process. In Shooting 1, you simply need to hit a moving target. In Shooting 2, you need to hit a target through a set of broken walls. Finally, Shooting 3 causes those walls to move, meaning you need to weave the arrow between the barriers and still strike the moving target. A true challenge. Big Sports 12 doesn't radically reinvent the concept of Pong or anything, but it does introduce enough considerations to make it weird and interesting. In addition to the complexity of dual rotary controls, the ball responds differently depending on how it strikes the paddle. The idea of adding English to a hit dates back to the original Pong, but Pong never caused the ball to go shooting across the screen at high speeds if you hit it just right. Like I said, weird and interesting. Next time on NES Works Guide in Epoch, does familiarity breed contempt? We are about to find out.